Yeah, further to what Denise said on the question of policy, we've written a series of articles in our publication, the Australian Alert Service, in the last few months about the evolution of those policies, and for all intents and purposes, for what Australians are experiencing now, you can take it back to two financial system inquiries. The first one was the Campbell inquiry that handed down its report in 1982, and that ushered in the era that we call neoliberalism. And it was the idea that the free market should reign, and deregulation swept through the economy and every aspect, especially of the financial system. And from then on, the banks were allowed to self-regulate. And in fact, to this day, the only, in terms of banking, the only form of regulation on the banks is what the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority imposes in the form of capital requirements for the banks, and their voluntary accordance with a code of conduct that they write for themselves, and that's not enforceable. This is the state of financial regulation in Australia. And the second inquiry was the Wallace inquiry in 1998, 1998, and that really gave us the modern ASIC as we know it today, where before that, the Australian Securities Commission was a lot more proactive in actually assessing the products that financial firms offered. After that, it was caveat emptor, justified by a philosophy that ASIC admitted to in 2014 hearings in Parliament, that it is governed by, its regulation is governed by a philosophy. And that philosophy is called the efficient markets theory, which is basically the idea the markets can't be wrong. The problem is the 2008 global financial crisis had proved that the markets can be dead wrong, and the so-called efficient markets theory that people had been imbibing on for 30 years was rubbish. The markets can be massively wrong. Yet this is the philosophy behind ASIC's form of regulation. Basically, it says that if you have some kind of scheme that people get ripped off in, then that will be the whole country will be aware of that, and they will naturally educate themselves. Ordinary people educate themselves and stay away from those sort of schemes in the future. And that is so naive, it's not funny, right? They know that. They know this has been the most of the people in Australia are not sophisticated investors. That if you have that kind of system, you are just encouraging white collar criminals to come up with more and more creative ways to rip people off, but they don't have to take responsibility for it because of caveat emptor. And why we paid attention to why the Citizens Party paid attention to the fight Denise Braley was involved in Western Australia with Sterling, is because we noted in that case that whereas there are literally hundreds of thousands of financial victims around Australia, there's 200,000 financial victims of just Ponzi schemes just since 2008 that have lost $40 billion. There is thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or more, of people who've been ripped off on mortgages. There's stacks more with insurance and all sorts of problems, right? But in the case of Sterling, what we were able to achieve was a Senate inquiry into an admittedly small scheme, but one where you cannot, in all conscience, stand by and let those victims be evicted because they're elderly people and they don't have an alternative. So you have to address it somehow. They were not victims of their stupidity, because in the normal sense of the term, because they did not invest. ASIC knew they'd been sucked into something that they didn't know they'd been sucked into because they did not invest. All they did is prepay their rent for the rest of their life. And yet ASIC had information they didn't have. And if ASIC had information they didn't have and had received repeated complaints from inside ASIC as to how dodgy this operation was, knowing that the victims were vulnerable elderly people and did nothing, sat on its hands for years and years and years and did nothing, then this one case is emblematic of how dysfunctional and unfit for purpose ASIC actually is. And so we need to use this case to force ASIC to compensate, or the government on ASIC's behalf to compensate. And if the government has to compensate, it then has to acknowledge it has to change ASIC. And if we can acknowledge it has to change ASIC, caveat emptor, the efficient markets theory, all has to go, and then you can begin to drain the swamp. But one final point that I want to make, and this is quite important, it's why it's in the Citizens Party's fighting platform. Just say we achieve everything we want to achieve in this regard in terms of a total overhaul of ASIC and a better system of financial regulation in Australia. We cannot move on as a country until we look at this massive pile of financial victims and address every case. There has to be some kind of truth and reconciliation type commission, like South Africa went through after apartheid, because this is such a systemic problem in Australia. We can't just say, oh yeah, look, we had a Royal Commission, yeah, we've brought in a few changes, let's move on. No. Billions and billions and billions of dollars will have to be paid out to lots and lots and lots of financial victims in Australia. And the whole country has to own up to that reality, because it would be unjust not to. We can't say, oh, well, let's just draw a line and move on. No. And that's why the Citizens Party is calling for full compensation for financial victims, and starting with the sterling first ones.